I want to know that. I want to know the symbology of the stairs. Is it a Harry Potter reference? Is it
Just where the desk is.
It's just
Everyone
where
always
the
asks
desk is. People read into this stuff. Well, our last conversation did very well. People were very moved by it. And I thought that was really quite cool.
Yeah, no, it was cool. I loved reading people's blogs about it, and that's the first video I've ever done where people like wrote about it.
Oh, that's a whole nother level. So we'll see if blog writing lasts like book writing. But who knows what the future holds. Well,
Right,
where would you like to start today?
well, I contacted you about a video idea that I've been having this idea for probably more than a year now, because I started, if you'll allow me to go on a rant, I started thinking about this seriously when I was 8 months pregnant, and somebody on YouTube, one of my viewers, kindly sent me a link to a song by one of the women in ABBA. I can't remember the name of the song, but she wrote a song about being 8 months pregnant, about her fears of bringing a child into a cruel world. And I think at the time there was some sort of conflict going on in her home country, and it was on her mind. When you have a baby living inside you, you can keep the baby safe, and there's something very comforting about that. Even when the world is a cruel, harsh place, you can you feel like you're able to give that protection. And then there is some anxiety. Well, I felt it, and this woman from ABBA also felt the same way about that transition of, you want to protect your child, but it's a cruel world out there. And I guess whenever I think about this, just how much suffering a person can live through, and how cruel the world can be to some people, or to most people even, it really does. I guess I started thinking about it in a different way, and a lot of, well, I don't want to say a lot. There's a handful of people. I don't know if you've come across these people, anti-natalists, and they are. It's a philosophy of trying to prevent suffering by encouraging people to not have children, because when there are no people, there can be no suffering. If my child was never born, she would never suffer. And so the ultimate way to prevent suffering is to not make any more people. And whether it's practical or not, whether they achieve this aim, it's in my nature to take ideas seriously when I come across them. So I had to confront this and go, okay, well, is this a moral thing to do? Like, can you bringing a human into the world knowing that they will suffer, and at some points in their life they will suffer terribly, everybody does. I have no idea that a war could break out, my child could be drafted, they might have a terminal disease, they might have some kind of horribly painful illness, and they'll certainly have their share of betrayals, and it's just the normal strife that comes from interacting with other humans. And it struck me as it's more of a theological question than a scientific one, which I guess is why I wanted to bring it to you, because you and I both agree that it is good to bring people into the world, knowing that they will suffer, and yet I don't feel like I can really satisfactorily justify it rationally. And I guess that's the subject I wanted to bring to you. And it kind of on the other hand, looking at this is the excerpt from the brothers Karamazov that I brought to your attention. I think we've both read the book before, but it's probably the most famous scene from that book is the conversation that Alyosha has with his older brother Ivan in the tavern about the problem of suffering. And Ivan brings it up in a slightly different way to how I'd heard it before. What the problem of suffering is usually the title given to the question of why does God allow suffering when he has the power to prevent it? If he is all powerful and he is benevolent, why is there suffering in the world? Ivan presents the problem differently. His question is, given that God does this and he believes in God, why should I want to be with such a God? Why should I want to walk with him and be a Christian? I think, he wants to return his ticket and respectfully deny God's benevolence. And he says he could not possibly justify this creation. He says it's too awful to be worth it. It's all of the benevolence in the world could not justify how awful the universe is. So that's quite a lot. What's your thought on that?
There's a lot there, and I think quite rightly you notice that this comes up when you enter the journey of parenting. I remember, so my oldest child is a male. And I remember after he was born in the Dominican Republic. After he was born, we had the decision of circumcision. And so then there's a lot of talk about circumcision, and they don't administer anesthesia to little boys when they circumcise them. And then they say things to mothers and fathers, especially to mothers, because they tend to be more sensitive about this than fathers. Mothers, and they say things like, well, at that age, they can't really see, and then they want to sort of say they can't really feel pain like we do, but they circumcise that little guy and he cries. And about a month into my son's life, this was our first child. We're living in the Dominican Republic. We'd been there less than a year. This was my seminary internship. So kind of a temporary posting, and then we would extend that to a permanent posting eventually. My child came down with a fever, and we had a very good doctor and they call them clinics in the Dominican Republic. They were something on a par with North American hospitals. They were private, not public. And the doctor was concerned about this fever. A 1-month-old shouldn't have a fever like this. And so the doctor said, well, what we have to do is really do a spinal tap to make sure. I don't know if it's meningitis or something. And so then they had to do a spinal tap on the little guy. And that is extraordinarily painful. And this was, my oldest son is now, let's see, it's 2020. So he turns 30 next February. And I still, just thinking about these things, thinking about that little guy in the hospital, he was okay, but there was nothing wrong with his spinal fluid. But Ivan has a point that there are a few things like the suffering of a child that mobilizes us experientially than just about anything else. And, it was really good to go through Ivan's argument again, because it comes basically, the question it seems to me that he raises is, can there be any justification for suffering? And, let's give the anti-natalists their due. Your little girl will suffer. In fact, your little girl suffers every day when
she had a spinal tap as well, by the way. That was one of the first sort of encounters you and I had together. I remember you telling me that before, is that she also had the same meningitis scare. And I asked the doctor, is it going to hurt? And he said, we'll give her some sucrose, which is like painkillers for babies. It's just, it's sugar.
It's sugar.
Basically. Yeah, I mean, you know what it was like. I just wanted
Yeah.
to bring that up. Please continue.
No, and so then, well, there's the question. And in a sense, you're giving consent to the doctor to do that spinal tap as and all they're doing is trying to figure out, is there a problem? That's all they're doing. And then right there is the question, is that suffering justified or justifiable? And as a parent, you make that call, because you could, if you told the doctor, no, I don't consent, I don't want you doing a spinal tap. Okay. But you knew the way, the doctor basically presented you the risk. Well, if we don't do the spinal tap, we don't know this, and so there we are. But suffering is to backtrack here, something has happened in our culture that has made us particularly allergic to suffering, and hierarchies of suffering have developed in our culture that are quite implicit. We find some suffering justifiable and other suffering not. And we do that all the time. We make those exchanges with people. The spinal tap for the infant is justifiable. The circumcision for the baby boy is justifiable. And of course, there's a big controversy around circumcision.
Well, I think you and I could get into an argument about that, but this isn't the time for that.
Okay. Well, but the question in some ways goes down to Ivan, because Ivan basically says, I am not going to accept, I'm not going to accept that at least the level of suffering that he highlighted in his story is justifiable. And because of that, I am not going to allow myself to be associated with. In fact, I wish myself divorced from the being that affords this. And in a sense, when I listened to that, I thought, well, he's just sort of given us an ontology of hell, because if you set aside the fire and the pitchforks and the eternal conscious torment and all of that, basically theologically, hell is the place where people who wish to divorce themselves from God go, to the degree that we can talk about going in a sense like that. But almost so many of the cultural issues that we are chewing on as a culture have to do with the justification or lack of it of suffering. Yet I find that enormously ironic, given the fact that suffering is very common. And I just, my wife and I were watching The Crown that came out on Netflix. And when I was watching, and again, whatever the representation, however historical or factual, any way you want to frame it, the fact that here you had this image of the suffering of these astoundingly wealthy and privileged people. That is what the show is about. And you have to ask yourself, what a strange creature we are, that we can in fact not just imagine, but we can observe the stories of the people who are the wealthiest, most powerful, most privileged beings on the planet, and their suffering seeming to be completely of what? I was talking to my wife, and so my wife is 3 years younger than I am, and she was telling me, when Diana got married to Charles, all of the girls that she knew wanted to be Diana. I mean, the story of the dress, the ceremony, all of that, they all wanted to be her. And then to have that story turn out the way it did, well, that says a lot about humanity, because we just had, just a few miles south of us here, a little boy. Everybody a lot of people in California, a lot of children in California are spending hours on Zoom in these supposed classrooms. an 11-year-old boy took his life with a gun while he was in his Zoom class at school. And I have a friend who is a psychologist, and he works with indigenous tribes in northern Canada. And the suicide rate, that the both child suicide and teen suicide rates in those places are, they're absolutely astounding. In these small communities, you'll have multiple attempts and suicide successes in these communities during the course of a year. And you'll have families in which there are multiple attempts and successful suicides. What does that say about us? None of these people are lacking in food. This little boy, what does it mean that an 11-year-old would suffer to a degree that he would take his life in the way that he did? So I say all of that hopefully to contextualize and to reframe what I think is so often the frame in our culture, which basically says that suffering is avoidable and we know how to solve it. I don't think most of our instinctive approaches to suffering are anywhere close to addressing it. And that is best illustrated, I think, by the Royals. Because if anyone in the world, if our solutions to suffering were in any way effective, the Royals should be the happiest people around, shouldn't they? And they are not. So what on earth are we talking about?
Yeah. I think I was kind of seduced by the philosophy of Stoicism going back a few years now. I've been sort of playing with that for a while, and I found the idea that anybody, no matter what their situation, could save themselves from suffering through implementing a philosophy. And I found that very attractive. And there was one lecture I saw where a modern Stoic philosopher said that the two of the most prominent Stoics are Epictetus, a slave, and Marcus Aurelius, an emperor. And both of these people had many reasons to be angry at the world. They had many problems, and they both found inner peace. They found meaning in their life. They were able to pursue virtue and to be happy in that, through Stoicism. And that, I'm not saying that's the only way to do it, or that Stoicism is all-encompassing and perfect, but there's something very attractive about the idea that you could reduce suffering, maybe not through rationality, maybe not through money or anything easy, but by changing your mindset. Or maybe your religion could do it, for instance. I'm sure you would argue that Christianity would be able to do something similar to what I'm proposing Stoicism might be able to do.
Well, Christianity is strange in this, because it is certainly true that, well, there are many ways to address suffering. Buddhism, for example, is quite famous for noting something that, let's say, Diana was attached to. Let's argue that Diana was attached to the idea or the vision of some fulfilling, lovely marriage to a man who loved her. And if she had given up that attachment, she could perhaps have enjoyed all of the privileges and things that she could have enjoyed as a royal. And so Buddhism can deal with suffering. I think Stoicism, I think a good many philosophies can deal with suffering. In the video that I'm preparing, I'm going to read a story that I've read in a couple of my other videos. It's from a book about a woman in a really crappy state, at least in the United States. If you're in a state nursing home, it means you basically don't have any money, and they're kind of the bottom of the barrel. You really want to have money so you can be in better nursing homes in America. But so here's a woman who has lived 25 years in a state nursing home, blind, her face eaten by cancer. And this young Christian minister goes and visits her and discovers her to be probably the most joyful, happy person he had ever met. And so there's something going on at this level of suffering can be managed and avoided. That is, and in fact, it's potentially not that hard. Drugs can do it effectively. Um, Certain rigorous philosophical or religious systems can do it effectively. And okay, if we understand that to be true, why don't we just take those answers and live with them? Because we don't. So why, and I think this gets into more Jordan Peterson area, because we will see, the language is difficult. I would say we will happily endure suffering for the sake of meaning. And when it comes to Christianity, that tends to be the Christian solution. Because, of course, at the center of Christianity is a man who willingly suffers. He, and again, Peterson talks about this actually quite a bit. He voluntarily pursued suffering. And Peterson is right in that there's an aspect of that voluntary aspect is critical in terms of the interplay between meaning and suffering. And while it's very interesting that I think culturally we tend to fetishize suffering and its justification to achieve certain visions of reality that have somehow attracted us. An example of that would be the fact that in almost any political narrative, the suffering of a particular group is used as justification for a political particular solution. And connected with that is a particular ideal that we imagine is achievable, even if those ideas are actually rarely achievable. So there's something going on here with suffering that makes even the anti-natalists dramatically unpopular, but we don't know why. And I think a lot of it has to do with Tom Holland's point that Christianity has gotten deep into our culture. And if we were, people are very politically animated to seek solutions that avoid the suffering of future generations, of people they don't know personally. We very quickly worry about the and there are whole ranges of people whose suffering is sort of trotted out narratively, and then the solution presented, the political solution presented, and then argued for. Yet all of the narratives of fictional people that we obsess over and fervently pursue as a culture all involve suffering, the meaning behind suffering, and the achievement of a goal through suffering. I mean, look at any story or novel or movie or book, and they're all involved in that. And somehow we can tolerate the suffering of fictional characters. In fact, we love to enter into it vicariously in order to achieve a narrative outcome. And I think that's deeply connected with the idea that when we trot out these suffering narratives in our own culture, what we're really looking to do is participate in the same kinds of things we're watching in all of our movies and stories. And so again, I think this is a deep way in which Christianity has impacted our culture, because few people watch movies about, let's say, Buddhist or even, I don't know, Stoic suffering remedies as well as perhaps I think what Buddhist remedies are. Here's a person that isn't attached, so they suffer not. Makes a horrible movie. We don't care about it.
Yeah, I guess the closest thing I could think of is the Jedi Order in Star Wars. Not the main characters, but the sterile Jedi Council are it's kind of like a Buddhist Stoic kind of thing going on. You know, the attachment leads to hate, leads to anger, leads to suffering. You know, that's kind of what they're teaching, and that it's not exactly portrayed in a good light. But yeah, it's not really a narrative. It's not a story there. There needs to be dissatisfaction so that there can be a resolution.
Right.
Although, just as a side note, they do make films without conflict these days. The most recent one I can think of is called Chef, Jon Favreau, where it's a film about a guy who quits his job as a chef to become he starts a food van, and nothing goes wrong at all for the whole film. He just does really well. And he gets to he has a great date with Scarlett Johansson, and it's just nothing happens with the whole film. It's quite amazing.
Wow, I haven't seen it. It's probably a reason. Well, and I think that's even the what were the most boring parts of the worst Star Wars movies? It was all the Jedi Council. And what was even the dramatic parts, the most gripping parts and perhaps cringeworthy parts of those same bad Star Wars movies? It was, Obi-Wan trying to save Anakin. And it'd be like, Obi-Wan, look at your attachment to Anakin. If you know he's going to be evil, why don't you just kill him now?
Okay.
There's no movie there.
To get back onto the brothers. Oh, that's the doorbell. Sorry, I'll mute myself. Can you still? Well, I guess we're not live, are we? So who cares? Of course, I don't want to be rude to you. I'm so used to doing live streams that I thought there'd be people waiting for me to get back. It's just a delivery parcel. I'll wait for it to die down. To get back onto the brothers Karamazov, I think. I mean, it's never explicitly offered as a solution to the problem of suffering, but I think it is the closest the book comes to a solution is probably in the character of Alyosha, who embodies an opposite sort of philosophy to Ivan, of sort of spirituality versus Ivan's rationality. But there's also a story that comes from Ivan's subconscious. I don't know if you remember this. He has a kind of fever dream where the devil visits him in his house, and the devil tells him a story that I think Ivan himself wrote, or he wrote it years ago, about an atheist who goes to hell, and and then he's told that he can go to paradise if he walks for, 5 million years. If he walks 5 quadrillion miles, he can enter paradise. But because he's an atheist, he has to go for a very long walk first. And for the first 1,000 years, he just sits down on the ground because he thinks, what is the point in even starting? I'm not going to get there for millions and millions of years. He just sits down and gives up. And then I guess because he's such a stubborn atheist, he doesn't want to even start the journey. And eventually, after 1,000 years, he stands up and just starts to walk, and he does the whole thing. And then when he arrives in paradise, after the first second of being there, he feels that the whole walk was worth it. And I think when I thought about that, it made me think about suffering, and I don't want to say pleasure, but whatever the opposite of suffering is, happiness, contentment. I thought about it as a kind of on a scale where which one of these weighs more. In this story, we're presented with someone who feels such contentment in paradise that even 1 second of it is worth many millions of years of work. It wasn't like he was being tortured all that time. He was just walking, but you kind of get the idea that he was, it was worth all of the walking. And I started to, I think suffering is the default. It's kind of our default state of being as humans. Maybe it varies from person to person, but dissatisfaction is I think that's what happens if you just sit there and do nothing. You get bored, you get hungry, you'll feel there's no meaning in that. And even if your material needs are met, you get a kind of ennui, as the as the French call it. There's a boredom with life. People pursue, like you said in the stories, people suffer voluntarily, or rather we voluntarily enjoy suffering by watching media about people who are pursuing something more meaningful. And what am I saying? That I don't know if it's true that happiness can outweigh suffering in that way. And it's you can enjoy moments in your life where at the time it feels so profoundly lovely that it does feel like it was worth the suffering. And I started to feel that way more after having a child. There's the highs of happiness are higher, and there are some lows as well. But it feels like in those moments of joy, it feels like it was worth it, and all of the difficulty, all of the late nights and work and everything. It feels like it was worth it, even if it was just that one moment.
Yeah.
And I ask myself, if maybe this is too grim, but the Stoics encourage negative visualization, ideation, negative ideation. And I ask myself, if my daughter died tomorrow, would her life have been worth it? Did she like up to this point? Has her life been meaningful enough? And of course, it wouldn't be a happy thing, but could I be grateful for that first year of life, knowing that there was nothing to come afterwards, and she never made it to adulthood or childhood even?
Yeah.
And the suffering that we would go through as a result of that could is that too much to outweigh her entire life? I mean, that's kind of a selfish way of thinking about it, like thinking about it from my point of view, but that's the kind of thing I think about, and I haven't got any answers, but I think the solution that's being presented is that there is joy that is pure enough, that is great enough to outweigh some amount of suffering, or all suffering. If we could put it up on a utilitarian scale where everybody's joy is stacked together and everybody's suffering is stacked together, would one outweigh the other? And maybe that's just too, what's the word, esoteric. Maybe that doesn't really mean anything, because what are we going to do about that? But that's, I don't know. Do you have any ideas about that?
I don't know that it's esoteric. One of the interesting things about suffering is that even if you go to the hospital and you have pain, they'll tell you, a scale from 0 to 100 to talk about your pain. Suffering is a remarkably difficult thing for us to quantify or compare. Yet we all have sort of an instinctive way of doing it. And so if we look at the suffering of the royals, we sort of dismiss it because, oh, come on, you've got all of this, and you're asking us to feel sympathy for you. You talked about what is the opposite of suffering. And I think that's a good place to pause, because it's not happiness. It's probably satisfaction. And if you consider satisfaction is deeply, you can't experience satisfaction unless you experienced, in a sense, suffering. And meaning is in that matrix as well. I mean, the drama of suffering, suffering pushes us forward in ways that few other things do. One of the I had a friend who spent quite a few years smoking a lot of pot, and now that pot is legalized here in California, I've had some interesting conversations with people about pot, because it's different populations are now experimenting with it. But this one individual, and actually I've had the same conversations with a number of individuals that have basically said, you know, pot was good. I really enjoyed pot, but I never got anything done. Life sort of got gray. And at the end of a work day, I would sit home, I would light up, I would experience some enjoyment with that. And very quickly, I began to live in sort of a gray city. And so satisfaction is deeply related to suffering, goal seeking, and arriving. And so I think this is part of the answer. In fact, one of the things that strikes me as well is that Ivan's, the way that that chapter ends, before obviously the next chapter is the Grand Inquisitor. Ivan's heroic, and I think part of what attracts us to Ivan's bold declaration that he would essentially divorce himself from the author of a world in which children can suffer in the way that Ivan talked about it in that chapter. There's a heroicism in that, but that heroicism itself borrows on exactly what Ivan is complaining about. That even in that narrative, Ivan can't enjoy the satisfaction of his heroic rejection of the creator without himself borrowing suffering. That if suffering did not exist, Ivan's heroicism would not exist. And in some ways, what you're left with is sort of this non-existence is not zero, it's null. That's because zero in some ways presupposes existence. Null is no existence. And so what Peter Kraft, who is a philosopher, grew up in my tradition, eventually went over to become Roman Catholic. You can find a lot of his things. He has a talk on the dark side, which is all about suffering. And he makes the admission, he says, the ability of certain philosophical and religious traditions to banish suffering is remarkable and in many ways successful. But he, and I think he's right in this, and Christianity in general tends to look at that and say, no, I'll keep the heroic. And I think that has tended to be the answer of the West. There's a lot of interesting writing on suicide, because suicide in some ways gets at this question that, especially now with all these tools at our disposal, you can end yourself. And in some ways that is a very traditional response to suffering. You don't want to suffer, end yourself. And of course, Kierkegaard has in his book, Despair Unto Death, or The Sickness, I forget the name of it. It's one of his more famous things. He basically has the narrative in there of someone deciding to kill themselves only to discover that suicide was not an answer to the despair that was driving them to it. Now there's a horrible little narrative. What if the despair that is driving you to end your suffering and the hope that is held out by suicide is also found empty? And Kierkegaard sort of, basically declares, well, isn't that exactly what hell is? It's a despair that cannot be resolved by the physical cessation of our lives. And given the fact that a good amount of our suffering, especially in the affluent, secure West, is not in fact physical, but relational and existential, that might lead us to imagine that, well, if a good bit of our suffering is in fact existential, then a physical solution to it, well, that certainly is sort of dependent upon a naturalism or a certain scientific materialism. But the fact that so much suffering is existential might lead us to the horror of imagining that perhaps a physical solution can't finally ultimately address this existential crisis. So there's a lot here that that should probably make, and I think for this reason, so Vervaeke gets into the meaning crisis. And I think part of the reason that, whether you're sort of on the Christian end of addressing the meaning crisis or the non-theist end like John Vervaeke is, this is something that I think Stoics, Buddhists, humanity for a very long time has recognized does not finally fundamentally have a physicalist or materialist solution, which is exactly why here in late modernity, with sort of a scientific materialism being the default culture of the public space, people are once again looking for religious solutions. It makes perfect sense.
I think the question of suicide is it's interesting in the sense you're talking about. What it is so prevalent among the affluent, and I think that does say something about suffering, and especially what kind of suffering is the most prevalent at the moment. I guess I'm more interested in this anti-natalist idea, and although I don't think many people would call themselves anti-natalist, the birth rate is quite abominable in wealthy countries, and there's many reasons for that. I don't think you can say that it's definitely a result of the people of an anti-natalist philosophy, but I think that the idea that creating more people, creating the next generation, I think there is some skepticism about the ethics of that, even among people who are not particularly one philosophy or another, or they wouldn't. I think there may have been a time when it was perhaps when explicit religious beliefs were more widespread, when creating more life is an unadulterated good, and this idea that suffering can counteract that morality, that the suffering of the future child might bring that into question. I think that's perhaps a modern idea. I mean, it's not that modern, obviously, because it was in Brothers Karamazov. Although Ivan doesn't say anything about having children. He sort of talks on a sort of a grander scale. But maybe it's just my way of reading it. But it does seem like he's asking the same question. Yeah, if you create a person who will suffer, then you are creating suffering for that person,
and are responsible for it to one degree or another.
Yeah. I mean, I remember Jordan Peterson talking about the Mother Mary, who gives birth to Jesus, knowing that that his fate will be terrible, knowing that he will suffer, and she willingly goes through with that. And I don't know, I hate to come back to this, expecting you to come back with some answer that will be satisfying. I know it's not an easy question. Otherwise, it wouldn't have played Dostoevsky. He wouldn't have written such an amazing novel if it was an easy question to answer. But
well, let me ask you this question: why did you have a child?
I mean, I could answer it, but I don't know if the answer would be true. If you know what I mean.
Yeah,
It's
I do know what you mean.
I can do my best, but it probably wouldn't.
And that reality itself, we should ponder, because you're not being in any way, willingly duplicitous. You'd have no reason to, but there are answers within you that the member of your consciousness Congress moving your lips, or the one that has this, is available to your consciousness field, has access to. There's So go ahead and because almost every most abortions are in some ways implicitly justified by a sort of anti-natalism. This child will suffer, so let's end it here. Or maybe they don't want to say this child, but this biological natural process, if allowed to continue uninterrupted by our reasoned, violent intervention, will yield suffering, and so we wish to end it. And if you think about the process in that way, how much of human history isn't exactly those types of actions? So, and in modernity now, you at some point decided to have a child. Why?
It's the question of why supposes that it's a rational question, or
Right.
a rational decision. I mean, I'm not saying many people have children unintentionally. That wasn't the case for us.
I had a few. I have 5.
Let's not go there. It's if you want to ask me, should I commit suicide? The answer is no, pretty much 100% of the time. If you ask me, should I have a child? The answer is yes. I'd say almost 100% of the time. I mean, obviously that sounds so unwise, if that makes sense. The idea that everybody should have children regardless of their situation, there's part of me that kind of just says, do it. Not just for me. I mean, it's easy for me to bring a child into the world. We I've got a stable relationship. We've got plenty of money. We've got shelter and food, and we've got healthcare, and we've got spinal taps to make sure you don't have meningitis and all the horrors of that. And yet I feel like the production of more life, it would be good for the world, even if that weren't the case. Even if my husband and I were living in a tent, or if we were constantly getting into fights, or there's some really awful situations that people can be born into, and yet I still feel like those lives are valuable, and that there's hope for all human beings, and I can't justify that, because when I start using my brain sounds like Ivan from the Brothers Karamazov, and it sounds like the anti-natalists who have a go at me in my YouTube comment section.
Send it my way. I'll have a go at the anti-natalists.
But in my heart and in my action, I'm Alyosha, and I'm an optimist. And I think that that suffering can be justified by, I mean, maybe not even joy, maybe not even happiness, but just life. I feel like the world, the just living is good enough for every soul, if you let me use a religious
I'll
term.
let you.
Every soul that's born into this world. I mean, I don't know if I can justify it for the absolute most extreme situations where someone is born and then suffers unendingly until they die a young in infancy. I mean, that's awful. So in those situations, maybe I could say that that's not worth it. But for pretty much anyone else, I feel like the answer is just life, just to live and to create more life, regardless of the situation. But I can't justify it.
Yeah. Well, this business of justifying. So, one of Christ's commands in the Sermon on the Mount is judge not that you be not judged. And krino in Greek has sort of the same double edge as judge. But it very much has a sense of justification, because we can't, I love this moment it's in the Twin Towers where they're going through Moria, and Gandalf says to Frodo, even the wise can't see all ends. We can't, and that's one of the big issues that hovers over Tolkien's Hobbit and Lord of the Rings is Bilbo could have killed Gollum, but he does not. And of course, The Hobbit was sort of a children's book that Tolkien wrote for his kids, tried his hand at Lord of the Rings, a longer adult book. And the fate, the fate of Gollum, it's interesting because Gollum is a critical character in this story. And Tolkien has Gollum, survive all the way to the end. And in fact, Gollum is critical in the resolution of the story of the ring. Life is like that, and we can't do the math of justifying. I was thinking of the brothers Karamazov, and I was thinking about Ivan's argument, and I was thinking about Hitler. Okay, is it if let's imagine you knew that what Hitler was going to do, would throttling baby Hitler in his sleep be justifiable? Would you want to do it? And deep in one of the early things in the Old Testament is the Lord saying to the people, justice is mine, leave vengeance to me, don't take that up yourself. And the reason for it is, whenever we do, agency has a, we love agency, we are agents. In some ways, another element of default culture in the West is the celebration of agency. But it's a terrible thing sometimes to have power. And you see this with presidents who start wars and are conscientious. And I heard a story of George W. Bush's father. During the first Gulf War, he had been a Navy airman during World War II. So he, having been a soldier, knew that he was sending American pilots in harm's way over Iraq, and he agonized over that. And most of us respect that because he understood, rather than, let's say, a president who has not been in soldiers' boots or soldiers' cockpits. And so I think these things are built into us. And I think you're exactly right that you can make an argument at, why did you have a baby? But I look at a generation of young men and women that are, and it's especially difficult for young women because they are burning through their 20s and 30s. And there's a short window in our culture. You don't really want to have a baby when you're 16. You really probably want to have a baby between 25 and 32 in there. That's sort of ideal in terms of all the different things. So we've shortened that window up. And the reason to not have children, the freedom. I mean, I have my wife and I have 5 children. You know what they cost in the modern world? But yeah, now we've got our last one in college now. But I look back at my 5 children and I think, would I have done it any other way? all of the, and they will likely bring more suffering into my life. They are going to have painful relationships with other people. They are going to suffer, and when they suffer, I will suffer too. And I know that's coming because I saw my parents suffer in the suffering of me and my sisters, and we've had remarkably good lives. Although again, my youngest sister died 2 years ago, and that has brought immense suffering into my mother's life, just the death of my sister. And so, basically the question of life is, in fact, will you hazard suffering for something? And I think the best word we have for it is meaning. And the answer, the living answer is yes. And my admonition to people is risk it, because the opposite of that is in some ways just sort of a gray death. But again, can we articulate this? Can we justify it to each other? Can we do the math? No, we can't. And so in a sense, as our agency ramps up in the modern world, as we increasingly have more and more power over the planet, over each other, well, all of this ramps up too. And I perhaps is part of the reason why people are opting out of the most agentic thing they can do, which is bring another child into this world.
It's too much responsibility.
Yeah.
It's scary.
Yeah, it is scary.
Well, that's what we started off, isn't it? I mean, I just to end on a really bleak note. I mean, you try to make it hopeful, but I always think about that night when they took the baby away for the spinal tap. Just understandably, they didn't want me to be in the same room. They just took her away and did it somewhere else.
Yeah, because they knew what you would do.
Yeah,
I was in the same boat.
I was terrified and exhausted because I'd just given birth, and my husband had gone home because we thought we were out of the danger zone. We thought it was all over. The most interesting stuff's already happened, and I was on my own. And they took the baby away, and I was crying in the hospital bed on a ward. There's like five families there, and a woman who, she was the relative, maybe she was the mother of a woman who'd just given birth, and she didn't speak very good English. I think she was Polish. I don't think I even told my husband this, but she's an old, I don't say an old lady, 60 or something. She saw me crying, and she saw there was no baby there, and I think she must have thought the baby died, because she came to comfort me, and it's something that an English woman would never have done. I mean, a woman might have come to comfort me, but this woman, she took my face in her hands, and she wiped the tears from my eyes like this, and like brushed like all the way under my chin like this, and it was very odd. And I felt quite self-conscious, because I kind of thought, this woman thinks my baby's died, and that is like, it was kind of awkward because I didn't want to tell her that, but I also I just didn't want to have that conversation. It was so terrifying to think, just to think that she thought that was terrifying.
Yeah.
in a horrible way. She
Yeah.
she muttered some words to me about what did she say? She said God sends us these things, something like that. She didn't speak good English, she was doing her best, and I can't, I'm not trying to tell you that was comforting to me. I was just very confused about the situation at that moment.
Yeah.
Not confused, but just.
Well, how do you feel about it now?
Well, we just talked about it for an hour, so that's a pretty good summary. And I think.
What would you like? Okay, so we started out. We have this thing we call a question, and there's even in a very shallow way a degree of suffering in this question. The question itself longs for satisfaction. What satisfaction are you looking for?
I want that rational justification for my feeling, my assertion, or my decision to bring life into the world. I want a language to explain that decision and that assertion. You know what I said a few minutes ago about how I think people should create more life, no matter what suffering they imagine could happen, no matter what war is going on. I feel that strongly, and I've been searching for, like I said, more than a year for a way to justify that, for a way to put that into language. And it's one of those questions that I thought I'd be able to answer, or that I'd be able to find the language to talk about by looking at Christianity, or Lord of the Rings, whatever, to find an allegory or a something, I don't know, a way to articulate it that doesn't make me sound completely mad. Or maybe it will make me sound completely mad, but it'll be satisfying to me.
What would make you sound mad about this? Because I'm serious. That's a serious question, and it's a very interesting question, because, I mean, it's a weird thing in our culture that, okay, so if I had an explanation that I could give you, 1 or 2 or 3 sentences that I could send it in a tweet and say, here it is, what would that do for you? Why do you want that?
Well, I guess that's my nature. That's what I do on YouTube. I've been doing it for 3 years. Where there's a question that is in my mind.
Yes.
And I try to figure out.
There's a little bit of suffering you're looking for satisfaction from. I'm
looking for a way. What I try to do on YouTube is not to come up with an answer, but to come up with a more interesting way of phrasing the question. And I don't know how to say it. That is what I do. I don't know what to say, except that that's what my brain does when I encounter something that I can't fully comprehend.
I think it's a good thing. I think it's a fruitful thing. I'm not in any way trying to deter you from it, but it's an interesting thing. And it's interesting in that, I mean, there are lots of available answers. One of them would be, well, it's evolution has programmed into you the desire to reproduce. Well, there's an answer, but bang, there it is.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to satisfy. I don't like that
answer.
Why not? What's wrong with that answer? Because that's the general answer that would be given, right? That is the standard answer. It's just been programmed in.
Yeah. No, I definitely can sympathize with that answer. And I guess maybe that's what I'm frightened of, is the idea that it's a selfish thing, and then when examined rationally, it's debunked, as we like to say these days. The idea that if the answer is that simple, then it's simply selfish, and you can therefore say, well, don't be so selfish.
What is selfish about that? It's not. There's no self in. You're not in that answer at all. There's no you in that answer. It's just that Poe has been designed by evolution to reproduce. And so at some point she thought, okay, let's reproduce. And you've reproduced. There's no you in that answer. You're just a cog in the machine.
I guess the machine that you're talking about is what Richard Dawkins described in The Selfish Gene, which is the selfish gene. And someone picked me up on my pronunciation of the selfish gene, because it's not supposed to be the gene for selfishness. It's supposed to be the fact that genes are selfish, and that they're only concerned with propagating.
Well, the irony, of course, in that entire little story that is told is genes have no self. That's the point of the story. They have no self. They're automatic. and we tell, and then we embroider them up with a self and give it a moral valence and say they ought not to be that way. And I find Brett Weinstein doing this all the time, and Sam Adams on the Discord server noted one day to me, that's a very Gnostic move, because it basically says that the world was created by an evil God because now we have all these selfish genes. But it's the moral criticism of selfishness comes from Christianity. And the anti-natalism is in some ways a response to that, and saying, well, your existence is selfish, but there's no self in you or your child. But right away, when we'd say your child's existence is selfish, part of you would say, well, nobody knows the selfishness of your child more than you do. At the same time, for someone to say, no, your child's existence is selfish on your child's part, you as a mother would probably turn around and say, how dare you? My child, I brought my child into the world. She didn't ask. And so don't put that blame on her, which actually is another piece of what's under Ivan's argument, which is these children didn't get asked to brought into the suffering world. Someone else took responsibility for them. And if we follow up the chain of command, the creator is all the way at the beginning of it. So there are a lot of things built into these arguments that people sort of blithely go over. And I think it's worthwhile, which you're, quite obviously. Another good question would be, what is it about you, Poe, that makes you, when you hear these arguments, ask these really hard questions about, well, why, what is, why did I want to have this baby? And this evolutionary answer, you find unsatisfied, you don't find that satisfying at all. And I think rightfully so, because something that you see in the glory of your child and in the drama of your life suggests that it's not just, a hen and a rooster. There's more to this. And again, someone could dismiss it and say, well, that's just because you have that big brain of yours, and all the exaptation and all of that is deceptive. And what you really need to do is somehow divorce yourself from all that thinking and just say, we reproduced just like the hen and the rooster. And you say, no, actually, my husband and I thought about this intentionally, and we prepared a home for it. And in fact, we live nested in a society that has education and hospitals and art. And I mean, there's a world of things around your child that the hen and the rooster do not have. And none of that is sort of, well, we'll just dismiss it all by saying life reproduces. How selfish. Again, this stuff to me, I hear people trot this stuff out and I think this makes no sense at all. This makes no sense at all.
Okay, well, when I say selfish, let's put it this way. To put it into, to take myself out of myself and examine exactly what I'm doing. You could say that the reason I'm picking so hard at this scab is that I have done this already. I have already reproduced. And I've been posed this question, why did you do that? And all of my mental faculties are dedicated to justifying the decision I have already made. One of the most important decisions, maybe the most important decision I've ever made. I don't want to believe that I could have done the wrong thing. And so that's why I'm working so hard on it.
Well, and also lingering, perhaps, will you do it again? Will you produce another?
I hope so.
You're not living in one child China here. But
that's that's throwing, you could say that's throwing bad money after good. Is that expression? Throwing good money after bad.
Throwing good money after bad.
I'm so dedicated to justifying my decision that I'll do it again just to prove I did the right thing. I guess what I want to know, what I really am seeking a evidence for, I want to know that what I did by creating a new life was in her best interest, not in my best interest.
Hmm.
That's the constant accusation, is that it's selfish to have children. And if you ask people why did you have children, you'll sometimes trick them into saying something selfish, like, I need I don't want to end up in a care home when I'm too old to take care of myself. Or oh, they bring such joy. I don't want to say that. I mean, being a parent does bring me joy, but I don't want to say that that's why I did it. That answer is too selfish for me. I can't, because life is so full of suffering that is selfish. I think to prioritize my own joy over my daughter having to live through a spinal tap.
We live in such a strange culture that so easily justifies, I would say European vacations, but you're already living there. American vacations, or fine clothing, or a better home, or develop tastes in wine or music, throwing all kinds of money at it. But to have a child is somehow selfish. And it's like, it has to be people who have never had a making up these arguments, because if there's one thing having a child teaches you, it's just how selfish you were before you had that child, because that child will beat that out of you. How you selfish person want to sleep all night.
Well, people do take on, like we said, people do take on these difficulties in life for their own ethical satisfaction. The one that, well, it brings up a lot of arguments, but the fact that people are so willing to become vegetarian or vegan, or to recycle all of their rubbish, as we call it in England, they'll voluntarily go out and sort through refuse into different baskets, because they believe that there is some good for it. That there is something. That there is a selfish way to be selfless, and they call it virtue signaling these days.
Well, and I look at these people and say, all right, you really want to do this? Why don't you give up everything that you have, go to some developing world country, figure out how to divest yourself of your European passport and live on 50 cents a day along with the rest of the people, and then share with them this idea that you had, and they might just lock you up. Because the problem that you'll actually have is that you will begin to discover all of the ways that you have been, in fact, molded and shaped completely involuntarily by your nation of origin. And you may very well in that village or community wind up, helping other people. Again, I've been a foreign missionary. You run through some of these arguments sometime, and again, it just gets insane, because one of the things that you do when you go overseas is, okay, we're going to go and we're going to train these people. Okay, so we're training them into what? Well, we're training them sort of into the world network, and so now they are going to be better producers, and hence probably also better consumers. And in other words, we have all these narratives about the wastefulness of our lifestyles in the developed world, which are true. And then all of the so-called altruistic ideas we have about the developing world feeling guilty about our affluence basically wants to drown the world in the consumerism we already participate in. I mean, these things you just go crazy with these things. And so if someone actually wanted to address them, go ahead, try. See where it goes. I'd be happy to watch. And I watch people do it in small ways, and usually it just gets rather silly. And at some point, they will probably begin to ask the kinds of questions that you are asking, which are deeper questions about meaning and suffering and truth, and about your own life. But this, I completely understand the arguments about number of people in the world. but we can take those arguments back 100 years. There's a really wonderful book, The Alchemy of Air, which talks about the fixation of nitrogen. And it talks about some guesses that the fixation of nitrogen happened basically before the First World War. And basically that the carrying capacity without synthetic fertilizer of the planet is maybe 3.5 to 4 billion people. Okay, so was it a good thing that we and part of the impetus behind the First and Second World War was the fact that Germany was basically looking at the fact that they were going to struggle to feed their own people because their population is so large and their land is so poor, and European soils are, there's so many areas of knowledge out there, and there's so many elements out there in the world that we can't begin to do the math of this. So then you get into, okay, we developed synthetic fertilizer, and now we've royally messed up the nitrogen cycle on the planet, which, leads to algae blooms, and we can talk about CO2 production and. It's just, the more you know.
Yeah, no kidding. I was just thinking that.
Your camera got unfocused. You might want to focus that again.
Is that? It's just auto, so
yeah,
there's nothing
okay.
I can do except to mess
there
it
it
up
is.
and
Yep.
fix itself.
Yep, it's back on now. It's back on you.
Yeah, no, I'd never even heard about the fixation of nitrogen. I knew nitrogen was a fertilizer, but
The Alchemy of Air, read it. It's a wonderful book, and it's the story, and again, history has so many of these strange stories where here's this German Jew who, he sort of, converted to Christianity because of anti-Semitism and was a very loyal German. And actually, part of the fixation of nitrogen that was so critical for the development of were munitions. And he was actually one of the guys who developed the gas for gas warfare in World War I. He actually developed the gas that would be used in the death camps to exterminate Jews. And it's an astounding story. And, we all enjoy this abundance of cheap carbohydrates via grain by synthetic fertilizer, and a population on the earth of 7-8 billion people. We are small creatures, and in some ways the pretense, on one hand, we have to be responsible, and so we need to use reason, we need to ask hard questions, but the more you know, the more you begin to realize who of us can really answer these questions finally. And if we can't, what does that mean about the world? Is the world, is this just chaos? Or is meaning just an emotion that spurs us on to win battles and compete successfully against rival Homo sapiens? I think about this stuff plenty too, obviously. I'm not much different from you. I want an explanation too, but the more you read and the longer you live, and at some point you have to throw up your hands and say, hey, I had 5 children. All of those are growing up to be, consumers, and they, my wife and I have put all of our 5 children through college. David Brooks recently wrote a New York Times editorial basically saying that, all these people complaining about privilege, well, they just pass on their privilege to their children. My wife and I, my wife is at least as smart as I am. We've passed on our genetic material. We parented them as best we could. We have sent them to college. They are, in one way or another, striving to succeed in this world and outcompete their fellow Homo sapiens. And that's what you want for your child too. You want your little girl to go out into the world and to do at least as good as you and your husband have done. Where does that come from? And do you really want to divorce yourself from it? I don't think so.
No. I don't know if it's true, but I heard a podcast recently about how inequality is in America is largely driven by more effective what do you call it? More effective mating of privileged people, where you now have rich intelligent people marry other rich intelligent people rather than just whoever they happened to bump into when they were 18. And now you have those people become extremely rich and have extremely rich children when they might have shared their wealth with some, like I said, just some random person who's could have been lower than them in social status and wealth and maybe intelligence as well. I don't know where I was going with that, but it's
we left the old world only to recreate it. That's what we did. We don't have royals, but Barack and Michelle Obama are, for all practical purposes, for 50% of the United States, royalty. They are.
How much of your thinking has been influenced by the crown, then? Seems like seems like a lot of your
I never paid any attention to those people until that movie came out, or that series came out. I had a friend who was a Brit in the DR. He was a missionary there, and he always said, the royals, they're not like us. And I thought, what does he mean by that?
Yeah, I haven't seen it. They take it seriously here, the royals in general.
Well, it just fascinated me thinking about how that family. So then I was watching another program with my wife about it, and basically, in the First World War, they weren't always the House of Windsor. They had this other name, which was the name of the bomber that dropped bombs on London in World War I, and knew they had to do a PR move to change. What's that?
They had a German name, right?
Yeah, because they were Germans. And you look at that and you just think, oh, this is one heck of a PR move to get but that's how we are. But American politics, gosh, look what we're in the middle of right now. So we're just people. We do silly things.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't like to be royal anyway.
Why not?
Everything you just said. I mean, it's just complicated, isn't it? I've been thinking about making a video about about status and money, and in our last talk, I said that I think I might have the life that people would want to have if they could play a video game of anyone's life. I think they'd want to play my life, and I believe that. Maybe that's conceited. I don't know. Maybe that's just grateful. I think I've got I wouldn't like to be anyone else, least of all royal. But I think
do you know a video game that looks like your life?
No. No one would play that. But if you could live it, if you could actually live it, it would be better than anyone else's life, I think.
Well, and Jonathan Haidt in the Happiness Hypothesis basically talks about the cortical lottery, that some of us tend to be satisfied. We're just sort of happy. I'm a person like that. I'm an above average happy person. And when I look at my children, one of my sons in particular, he's a happy kid. He's always been a happy kid, and things go well for him. He's smart. He's good looking. I mean, he's going to have probably a golden life in a lot of ways. And I look at other people, they're just miserable. I look at men and women. Women are higher in neuroticism. Generally speaking, they tend to worry more. And you just watch all this stuff. And so there's lots of explanations that tell us, why I'm happy, because, I inherited happiness genes. Lucky for me.
It's a good thing you passed them on then.
Yeah, I suppose so. Maybe we should do eugenics and only allow happy people to reproduce.
Or maybe that will happen anyway, since all the miserable gits are Ivan Karamazov and anti-natalists.
Well, and this is part of the reason why part of an explanation why religious people continue to dominate the planet. They reproduce. Other people don't.
Well, we'll see how that goes. Yeah, I mean, you're right. If you look at the people who have like more than 4 kids, it's usually, religious fundamentalists or just religious people.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see what happens with that, if anything does.
Well, usually the unsuccessful tribes of the world just kind of disappear quietly. They disappear unnoticed until someone decides that they want to notice them, and then weaponizing suffering once again come out and declare, oh, look at all of this suffering from these disappearing tribes of the world, and then the whole thing starts over again. Oh, we've got to end this suffering. Oh, okay.
All right. Well, maybe can I let you go?
Yes, you can. I hope this was worthwhile. I don't know if I helped you in any way at all.
Well, I had fun. So you alleviated my suffering for an hour and a half.
Oh, good.
Say that.
Well, enjoy your child and enjoy your life that should be
golden,
memorialized in video games. And maybe you should write a video game of your own life and see if anybody wants to play it.
They won't, but they do. People turn up to my videos and watch them every week, so there must be something that people are enjoying.
I think there are. So
all right, I'll be seeing you in your future videos.
Yes, I will be there.
We'll cook again sometime.
It's great talking to you.
Yeah, you too.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night or good day.